Okay, we're live. Great. Hi, everybody. I'm Jennifer Taylor Skinner, and welcome to Building Effective Political Allyship with Women of Color. I'm really excited about this panel, and we only have 50 minutes, so I want to cover a lot of ground in that 50 minutes. It's not a lot of time. Hopefully, we'll have a few minutes at the end for your questions, and so I won't take up much time with the introduction, but I want to introduce you to our panelists, and then I'll go give you a brief overview of what this panel is about and what we'll cover. So, without further ado, the first panelist is Sayu Bhajwani. She is the founder and president of New American Leaders, and they recruit, is an organization that recruits and trains and supports first, second, and third generation Americans to run for office and for leadership roles. Okay. And secondly, Dr. Sarah Myrie. She is a climate scientist and ocean scientist, and her expertise is in environmental justice. And she's also the executive director of the Rowan Institute, and that's a think tank for public leadership on public leadership on climate change. And last but not least is Tammy Sawyer. She's the county commissioner of Shelby County, Tennessee, and she's the national field director of Black Voters Matter. And she's also the leader behind the Take 'em Down 901 campaign. And if you don't know what that is, 901 is the area code for Memphis, Tennessee, and Shelby County, of course, Memphis, Tennessee, is in Memphis, Tennessee. And that was a campaign where they removed Confederate monuments and statues around the town. It was a really amazing campaign, really beautiful. So all of these women, I feel like their bios, those short bios, don't really do them justice. You know, I admire all of their work, and you know, I hate to be cliche, but they're all badasses. So, and they'll have some amazing things for you today. And by the way, again, I'm Jennifer Taylor Skinner. I am the founder and host of the Electorate podcast, and that's a podcast that uplifts the voices of women and gender nonconforming community activists and academics and authors, and I bring their work to the public. And I'm also the executive producer of the Gatekeepers podcast. It's a collaborative podcast with Dame Magazine, and that goes over the history of segregation. And that'll be live in a couple of weeks if you haven't heard of that. So, about this panel. So this panel, again, it's something that's really close to my heart, you know, political allyship for women of color. I just want to be clear, when I say political allyship, I mean both political leadership, women who are in political positions, and the policies that support women of color, the constituents, right, as well. So what policies are best for women of color and those marginalized groups in our society. And it's something that I've been thinking about for a while, kind of obsessively, you know, just because a lot of women of color are stepping up to leadership roles, right? And it's something that I think that we really need to discuss. It's a conversation I think that's really relevant right now. And yeah, I mean, we've got amazing women right now, the squad, and you know, we've got of course our VP nominee, Kamala Harris. A lot of other women of color are stepping up to leadership, and I think this year in 2020 we have, I think, something like 120 Black women alone who've registered to run for positions in Congress. And that's just Black women. That doesn't include all the other women of color who've running. So this is a record year, historic year for the number of women of color who are running. And you think about the people who are already in leadership, you know, Barbara Lee and Maxine Waters, and like I said, the squad, you know, there's Lauren Underwood, Stacey Abrams, all of these women who are leading these major important movements in the progressive space. They're doing amazing things. And, you know, they don't always have, you know, a solid base of allyship on the left. We're not talking about conservatives, but just on the left. So that's what this panel is about. Like, how can we do better by these women who are stepping up to leadership and give them consistent, reliable allyship? Okay. I just realized that, you know, I don't know if everyone's here yet. It's just 8 a.m. right now, but so we'll just jump in. Okay. So I'll just start with the first question, one that really kind of stuck with me when we were kind of talking about online. I think this is probably one of the most harmful practices in terms of weakening allyship for women of color. And I can't remember who brought this up for me, but it was one that I couldn't stop thinking about. It's about aligning oneself with the white patriarchal power structure, right? And, you know, when we do that, you know, what that looks like practically and how that hurts allyship for women of color. And, you know, when we fail to divest from the white patriarchy, what that does, right, for our allyship. And I want to start with you, Sayu, because I know you run an organization. What does that look practically for you?
Thank you, Jen, and thanks for organizing this, and welcome everyone. A couple of things that I'll share concretely, because I think that for an organization like ours, there's a sense that because we serve and work with a diverse community, we don't have to be intentional about equity and inclusion. And so, you know, some of that, frankly, I've learned the hard way. I think our team has learned the hard way. And so specifically what that means is A, not making assumptions, B, being very intentional about, you know, who is at the table, who we're inviting to speak, who we're recruiting to staff our programs and our trainings. And, you know, for us, there is I mean, I'll say when you're talking about an organization that is multiracial and all gender, it can, you can very easily start to privilege one group over another just because, again, this assumption that because we're multiracial, at some point or another, everybody's story gets heard is not an assumption that, is an assumption that we have had to challenge ourselves on, right? And so how do you uplift a shared narrative without erasing individual stories? And I feel like that is a constant tension and a constant, something that we have to constantly focus on. So I'll just name that that's one thing, the sort of intentionality of it. And then the other piece of it, I think, is working in terms of allyship and women of color in particular. How do we work in coalition with organizations that that have a greater level of cultural competency on particular groups, right? So groups like Latinas Represent or Higher Heights, who are working with specific groups of women of color, Black women or Latinas, and how do we rely on their specific cultural competency and expertise, partner with them, and amplify the voices of all the folks that we're serving. So those are two examples.
And Sarah, I know you've talked about this a lot in the climate space. I you know, I've kind of stalked you on social media, and I know you're always talking about, you know, how, you know, climate science specifically has been kind of masculinized, and I think that sometimes how, you know, women of color, their voices recede. So talk about that in your space, what that means, investing in it in the climate science space.
Yeah, I'm happy to, and thanks for hosting this panel, and it's really great to be in conversation with all of you about this. And part of what I just heard Sayu say about these assumptions and interrogating those assumptions, this is really key in the climate spaces, because I think the way that whiteness transacts in leadership norms, the way that I have seen it done, is with this assumption of moral goodness, that you could not possibly be operating without accountability, and that you weaponize that assumption of moral goodness in spaces that prevent that sort of shared narrative, that building of shared narrative. It's a transaction of erasure that sort of continued to be in that lane of, you know, I'm the person with the moral goodness. I'm assuming that I'm always coming in, and that is what white saviorism looks like in the climate spaces. And so we see in climate stories again and again and again, the same stories being told of the great men and the great women on top of the hill, giving solutions to people that need solutions, giving information to people that need, you know, information. And so the norms in these transactions are absolutely patriarchal, and they come from a white supremacist framework defined by power over and not power with. And that happens in like the largest sort of organizing constructs in climate science and in academic science. And then also happens at these smaller, more granular levels around individual relationship building and trust building. So I think that this is one of those dynamics that scales from very large to then the microcosms of interpersonal relationships too.
Well, I love that. So weaponizing the assumption of moral goodness, right? And also power over versus power with, right? I think that's beautiful. Yeah. So Tammy, on to you. So by the way, just a little bit of history. Tammy ran for mayor of Memphis, and I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. And so I know the culture there. And the thing that always surprises me about Memphis when I look back and, you know, politically to see what's going on, is that I think Memphis right now is like 70 or 65% Black, right? But I don't think that the political leadership is representative of that. So you must have this problem leading in Memphis. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. Thank you, as has been stated, Jen, for this opportunity to speak today and to join such an esteemed panel. But yeah, so where I live, where I represent, I'm county commissioner here. Memphis and Shelby County are between 60 and 65% African American, Black. And our political leadership in some ways does match up, like the city of Memphis city council is majority Black. But when it comes down to our larger representative, we have a white congressman, we have a white mayor, we have two white senators. You know, when you go on to that, our funding base is white. So when you get into the thought about allyship, that access to power, right? So we can win a city council seat, we can win a commission seat, but we don't have the money to make the decisions. We have one of the largest racial wealth gaps in the country. By about a $75,000 difference between white families and Black families. Our schools are so entrenched in poverty that 100% of our students receive free or reduced lunch because they can't make the difference between the few kids in the majority of our schools who wouldn't need it. So they just give it to everyone. And we're home to Federal Express, which doesn't pay taxes and is $1 billion industry. And just investigative report was released that they make the top CEOs make 332 times what the average employee makes. And a lot of people in Memphis rely on work at FedEx, that hub work, that shipping work. So when we talk about allyship, for me, we need economic allyship. And not handouts, you know, not throwing us a bone, but really divesting yourself and asking, are you making room? When you're in small Southern towns, or even we're a bigger Southern town, you know, which is ironically also, Southern cities are the fastest growing homes for Latinx people as well. Memphis has the largest Latinx population in Tennessee, and it's swiftly growing year by year. And that's related to these manufacturing and hub jobs that we have. And then it comes out, you know, for example, when COVID-19 hit, 600 Latinx employees who were underpaid, no health insurance, found themselves infected with COVID-19, you know, and working in poultry factories in Mississippi. And so for me, there's another layer of allyship, in addition to the economic allyship, and I'll wrap up, but there's also regional allyship. A lot of people look at Southerners as not having the wherewithal or the knowledge or the gravitas to manage our situations or to understand what we're under, but there's such an economic weight that we are suffering from, that we're crushed by, that true allies will see that we know what's happening, we're trying to fight what's happening, we don't always have the resources to do so.
Yeah, that's excellent. You know, I just want to make a comment because I think, Tammy, you and I have talked about this offline, because I have family that works at FedEx, and I know it's a huge part of the culture there. And the thing is that you talk about like throwing bones and like economic allyship, right? And, you know, the huge wealth gap there, 332 times the wealth of, you know, the average worker. And the people who are in leadership there, they're not unintelligent people. They are aware of that, right? So you just, you know, when you're in a leadership position, just be mindful of that when you're making deals with people who you know, control that wealth gap and can reduce it if they want to, right? So I'll go on to the next question, the next topic, which is silencing women of color. And again, this is something that I saw happening over the past few years as more and more women took on leadership positions. You know, we saw it with Maxine Waters and Rashida Tlaib. You know, there were some of the earliest voices, the strongest voices against Trump, you know, saying impeachment. And, you know, just the policing of their behavior, and just, you know, the expectation that they represent, that they show some decorum. And, you know, a crisis, we're in a, you know, a crisis of democracy. And, you know, I think one of the things I want to say before we jump into that conversation is I think that with women of color specifically, when they say things, we hear it differently. We hear it through the lens of white patriarchy, right? So, you know, if Adam Schiff had said, you know, impeach the, you know, blankety blank, like Rashida Tlaib, we, you know, everyone would be cheering for him. So we hear that differently when it comes from women of color. And I think that when women of color and Black women are angry or they're passionate about something, that's the moment when you want to lean in and listen, because often they're the canaries in the coal mine, right? So I don't know, who do I want to start with here? Yeah, so let's start with you, Tammy, because you know, you've been in office in Memphis, and I would imagine, you know, especially kind of the southern, you know, the kind of southern nature and the culture there, that your voice has probably been policed. And I just want to know, you know, how you work against that, and have you had to try to fight to have your voice heard in the way that you want it to be heard?
Absolutely. I've been an outspoken Black girl most of my life, in very white spaces. I went to an all-white high school here in all-white girls high school here in Memphis. So I'm used to being asked to tone it down. I'm thankful for parents who, you know, reminded me, taught me that my voice was powerful and important. And had the ability to take that extra time, you know, to show me that it was okay to be an outspoken Black girl. You know, there's a lot of risk in being an outspoken woman, period. And then there's a lot of risk in being an outspoken, you know, woman of color, even more so. And so I could give numerous examples, but since we're talking about allyship, you know, I remember last year, right after the mayor's race, I was supposed to do a one-on-one conversation with a major feminist leader, thought leader, and because of the mayor's race, this person pulled out of they kicked me off the panel because they didn't want to upset the white male mayor incumbent of the city. So the bookstore and this person who I've grown up reading the quotes by, who, you know, I use in conversation, you know, unapologetically was like, I just don't want to be involved in possibly endorsing. And the conversation was supposed to happen after the mayor's race, so it wouldn't have been an endorsement. But people were so afraid to touch the opportunity for the first woman mayor, and I would have been the first woman mayor and the first woman of color, of course, right? But the allyship, you know, wasn't there. Wait your turn, your turn is coming. And even when I described that we are a city that's majority Black, 51% female, and the majority of our leadership is either male or white male, right? So I sit on a commission of 13 people, and again, 51% women in Memphis and Shelby County, 65% African American. I'm the only Black woman county commissioner on a body of 13. And people don't make space for us. They don't step aside and say, let's groom more Black women. You know, I was on a panel yesterday, a local panel, and we had this conversation with Black women electeds. Before we can even get our names on a ballot, we have to answer. I've been asked, who's your husband? You know, what's your sexuality? Why don't you have children yet? Don't you want to wait till your 40s? You've got your whole life to live, date. And so that allyship we're talking about, we allow this very misogynistic and misogynoir culture to exist in local politics. And we say, trust Black women, listen to Black women, trust women. And then other women aren't helping us dismantle, as we've seen, you know, just this week, the reaction to Kamala Harris getting the VP nod. She's getting worse from people for her past and the way that she rose up through the ranks, without folks acknowledging that Black women have very few paths. You know, to be a major prosecutor, to be a California senator, those coming out of the 90s, those are very limited paths. And instead of acknowledging that this is phenomenal for a Black woman to be in this space, we treat them harder. We give them more scrutiny. They give us more scrutiny than we would our counterparts. And I've experienced that as well.
Were you too ambitious, Tammy, for Memphis?
You know, shameless plug, there's a documentary coming out about my campaign. And at the end of it, my mom's voice closes the trailer and she says that she's too ambitious for Memphis. So
Wow.
and she tells me that all the time, you know, and as a Black Southern woman, you know, she's my Black steel magnolia. Jen knows that she's my steel magnolia, and she holds no bars because to her, I've chosen this path, right? And my ambition is going to get me in trouble. So when I have a bad day, she's like, you asked for this. We're supposed to be steeled against this, right? I think all of us, you know, could share, like, women of color, our moms often raise us to, like, hey, that's life. Dry those tears, deal with it. And it makes you a harder person, but the path shouldn't be that tough.
Good trouble. But so let me ask, and anyone can answer this question, Sayu or Sarah or Tammy. I think what makes me sad about this conversation is that I'm thinking about, you know, first of all, this is a broader cultural thing. This just isn't in the political sphere, right? It's broader than that. So how do we fix it here if it's much bigger than politics, right? Secondly, whose responsibility is it? Like, it makes me sad to listen to Tammy's answer and her to say, well, you know, I had to fight for my own voice, right? Whose responsibility is it to, you know, allow us to be us?
Can I jump in? Because I feel like I could pick up on so many things that Tammy said. But I want to start just by acknowledging, first of all, I'm 53 years old. So I say that because I definitely think that that my sort of age and generation engaged in our own self-policing, right? And a lot of that, I know for me, was inherited from my parents. I mean, they had immigrated from India to Belize, and in Belize, they focused on their economic well-being and were very much about, like, let's not upset the status quo. And I think now I understand that they saw something in me that they worried about. So, like, they were both proud of it, but were also like, holy crap, this woman is going to get herself into a lot of trouble. And so they engaged in a form of policing, but it was like a very mixed message situation, because on the one hand, it was like, you could do anything you want. On the other hand, it was like, oh my God, I don't know if you should be doing this. And so I think that I name that because I think a lot of us experience that internal tension, and I still have it. It's definitely better post 50, but it's still this thing of, like, I know that there is a problem and I know I should be saying something about it. And then there is a, like, okay, maybe you don't need to always use your voice this way, or maybe this is not, you know, like, there's a lot of that internal tension. I frame that particular example about my own experience in the context of how that informs the way we walk in the world, the way we walk in our institutions, the way we talk, in my case, to donors, to potential partners. It does affect everything. Like, how much do we speak up for the things we believe in and feel strongly about, and how much do we temper what we're saying for the audience, right? And at the root of all of that, I think, is and I'll try to articulately connect this to Kamala. I think that, you know, those of us who are happy about the symbolism of her being there, right? And it's not just symbolism, because at the end of the day, whatever we think about what she's done, she is a fierce and intelligent human being, you know, period, end of story. That, like, you may not agree with her, but she's really fierce and intelligent, and actually quite charismatic. So, but the fact is that the symbolism of her as a Black woman, as a daughter of immigrants, matters because we have suffered from lack of substantive attention to our issues. So it's not that her substantive stuff doesn't matter, but it's that her symbolism matters so much more because we have suffered from a lack of substantive attention. And so I think some of the policing is tied to the fact that, well, we just want to be at the table, right? If we just get there, or if we just get this grant, or if we just do this, then we'll have freedom to do X, Y, and Z. And I don't know if I, made that connection as well as I would have liked, but it matters that we have someone who looks like us. That is not the be all and the end all. In some ways, that is the first step. But in our country and in our society and in this moment, it is such a huge first step that, and yet we can't allow ourselves to be fully excited about it because of this substantive set of issues, and so I think that it's so hard to navigate this policing, because I see it with, Black-led nonprofit organizations in New York City, for example, who are the recipients of discretionary grants from their elected officials, right? So when we as an organization endorse challengers to those incumbents, the nonprofit organizations who are technically, the nonprofits and some of those leaders technically are not even supposed to be endorsing electeds, and they don't, but they're fearful of coming out in support of women of color challengers of long-term incumbents from whom they've been probably getting small, measly grants. But they know this is the devil they know, right? They know that this person's going to give them money. They know that if they call the office, they'll get a response. And so all of a sudden, an amazing woman of color challenger comes along, and they're scared to endorse them. And I think this is the sort of, we self-police, right? You don't want to take that chance, because what you have is so small, so mingy, so frankly meaningless, but it's something. And and we're holding on to those scraps because it's all we have. And how do we get to a place of looking at, and this is the last point that I'm going to make, is we have been used to dealing with scraps as people of color, as nonprofit leaders, all of these things. And we don't know, we learned in our organization after 2016, when all of a sudden people were like, oh yeah, actually democracy is really broken and we really do need new leaders. And people started giving our organization money, and it took about 18 months of receiving consistent funding for us to start to say, oh, we don't need to be thinking with a scrappy scarcity mentality. And we're still unlearning that, to be honest.
And that's very good. Speaking of scraps, right? I think also, and you may have said that, so forgive me if I'm repeating what you've said, but they're also really precarious, right? So the scraps are we police ourselves because we know that if we are loud and if we are passionate about something, but we're also wrong because we're not perfect, right? We won't be given that second chance. And I'm not picking on Allyship, but a white male leader would be given, right? We won't be given those second chances. So that's where the self-policing comes in. We have these scraps and we're holding on to them. And if we make a mistake, with our voices, that could be it for us. Sarah, do you want to add anything to this about policing voices of women of color?
Yeah, I think, listening to the conversation, one thing that I see white women doing in these spaces across hierarchy of race and gender is, because we sit in this space in between, not at the bottom and not at the top of this structural hierarchy of consequences, punishment, risk, intimidation, violence, and even death. We are operating often with this kind of mentality of, I'm going to make best with what I have. And so I see white women, and because I think leadership norms often scale down to interactions between individuals and organizations and leadership, a lot of this ends up being what happens in interpersonal communication, and then that gets magnified through social media. But white women's feminism and that second wave feminism, that narrative of I'm going to succeed in the world, but I'm going to do it by transacting as a man, as a white man, that limited lane, what I see is white women using the women of color around them to validate their leadership. And it's a flattening of the women of color around them. It's a transactional interaction that is about continuing to center and uphold the power of those white women. And while they are simultaneously, grooming and building, their public support for women of color, they are also then turning to the white men, the anchors of patriarchy around them, and supplicating to those white men. So they have not fully divested from the centers of white male power around themselves because it's too risky, or too scary, or they like the benefits of supplicating to white male power, and they want to continue to get that while they also court the accolades that comes from performative allyship in public. And that is an untenable situation. And when you reveal it, it's not only is it untenable, it's a broken theory of change, because true divestment from those structures of power requires much more intentional power sharing and reorganization of that moral center to get yourself out of the center and to be in right relationship with others. So I think that the behavior of white women in leadership through those transactions is effectively silencing and flattening and diminishing women of color leadership, but it's through this kind of agenda that they are manifesting as they try to continue to build and maintain power.
Oh, excellent. You know what? I know I'm biased, but I'm loving this panel. I'm learning so much from you three. So anyway, so let's go on. I know, Saeed, this is something that we said we wanted to talk about microaggressions. We can talk about it in any context you want, but I wanted to kind of focus on when we are in leadership and we are in a position to be allies for women of color, and we are the perpetrators of the microaggression. What's the best way to handle that, to heal and to kind of uplift them? What are some strategies? What do we do? What are the ingredients to an effective recovery?
I mean, I'll own I just learned about this concept of learning in public, which it seems so frightening, but it has been thrusted upon me anyway, so I might as well embrace it. So I'll say, I think the first thing that I have done is to, and this is going to seem very obvious probably to a lot of folks, but I don't think it's always obvious. In the last 6 months, probably, or 4 months, it's happened so many times that I have had to observe my own reactions to things, and to be really clear that my first point of entry into a conversation is to unapologetically apologize, not I'm sorry if this did this, or I'm sorry because I didn't mean that. It's I am sorry that you that I hurt you, and that everything comes after that. And again, it seems really obvious, but in the moment that you are being in the moment that something is being addressed to you, there is so much stuff that goes on in your head about well, I didn't mean that, and I'm so, and it really doesn't matter. That whole issue of impact versus intent, is something that I think very quickly started to learn that how to make that second nature. I am annoyed at myself for the fact that has not been second nature in the past. I had to work through that. That was really hamstringing me for a long time, by which I mean in COVID times, 14 weeks or something. And so that's one thing. I think then also engaging injured parties in figuring out the solution. Because part of white supremacy culture, and frankly, part of being, the eldest daughter of an immigrant family and an immigrant to the United States, has been oh, I'm supposed to figure out how to fix this, right? Fixing the thing is my superpower, right? And now I'm oh, turns out that's not such a great superpower, because relying on yourself to fix something is usually not the right way to go about things. And so sort of engaging the injured party in a dialogue about what to do, and using it as a learning opportunity. I'm just gonna stop there. So those are two things that I've really, I think are becoming more ingrained, and I would like to, in my own personal learning, in dealing with microaggressions that I am the perpetrator of, or macroaggressions for that matter, are just plain old fuck ups, you know, to be really clear that, like, I mean, I fucked up, done, period, end of story. And let's talk about how you need me to fix that, right? And what can I learn from you in this process? And then I think we're also not going to be able to fix everything. So there's also that. But I feel like I will be a better human being and a better leader if I just at least learn those two things and make them second nature.
That makes total sense, because if you are the perpetrator of the harm, how are you then best to come up with the best solution, right? Without engaging the injured party. That makes total sense. And I'm just curious, I'm just going to throw this out. When you were talking, I thought about this. When people are defensive or they're slow to apologize, there's a fear there, and I'm not really sure what the fear is, right? It's something that's keeping them from being vulnerable and being opening up and saying I fucked up. And I don't really know what that is. Is it the fear of being seen as a bad person? Especially like in the space that we work in, right? We are in a marginalized group, right? And for me, I think the fear probably comes from being seen as someone who is not always an ally when it's something that I care so deeply about, right? And I don't know what the fear is for other people, if that makes sense.
Well, I mean, I'll say, look, we've internalized perfectionism, or we've not internalized perfectionism, but internalized the aspiration to perfectionism. So sometimes I think it's like not even just not being a woman of color or not being a leader. It's just feeling like we're supposed to. I mean, because I think this affects women in general, not just women of color. I don't want to be wrong, but I will be wrong because I'm human. And the idea that I can't accept that is, I think, for me at least, rooted in perfectionism. And then there's shame. I mean, I feel that I'm a compassionate person and I don't want to hurt people. And when I hurt people, I feel embarrassed about it. But that centers my emotion rather than the emotion of the injured party,
That's perfect. Yeah. Okay. I get that. So, Tammy and Sarah, anything to add to that?
I just, wanted to add, we are groomed in white patriarchy. So apologizing is giving up power, and we're not trained or raised or taught to give up power. And, that's this whole conversation, right? How are we going to give up power to help other women, and especially women of color, have equal footing, have equal opportunity, have the ability to have funding without the risk of what happens when they use the funding in the way that's best for their community. And so we don't want to give this power up. We're taught not to get this power up. When we get, as Sayu said, we get these scraps and we hold on to them so tight because no one's ever had like this small piece of meat. And we don't realize there's like a whole, big steak out there that we can still eat. And so we won't give up what we have. And apologizing is a big part of that. And, being raised in, and trained in a white patriarchal tradition also makes it hard for us as BIPOC, as, women of color, to show up for other women of color, right? Crabs in a barrel, pigeons on the street, however you want to call it. But one thing that I've learned in my work over, the last few years, especially, is one, Black women and all women of color, we are not monolithic. So we're going to hurt each other, right? Because the way that I need you to show up for me might not be the way that Sayu needs you to show up for her. I might center Blackness over South Asianness, over Latinxness, right? And tell you to wait because I got to deal with my Black issues. And so I'm not being that ally that I'm yelling all day, whether it's on Twitter or in your face, that I'm asking white women to be. And so we have to think about that lift, about the intersectionality of the allyship that's required, that's necessary as women of color. Yes, our issues are different, Yes, especially in the United States, there's different ways that those things play out. There's anti-Blackness, and there's also, anti-immigrant stances. And we hurt each other over the scraps because we don't want to give up power, because we believe, right? I'm Black and I was born here, so I got more power than someone who's brown and wasn't. And even though I'm fighting for more power, I'm not going to share what little power I have with you. So I'm gonna marginalize you, right? I'm Latinx and fair skinned and can pass for white. So I'm not gonna have any conversations about defund the police and Black Lives Matter because I don't want to upset the position that my skin color, allows me to have. I'm not gonna bring that conversation to my workplace where people might not even know that, my name is actually, I'm actually a Latina, right? And so on and so forth. And so in being allies to ourselves, and women of color being allies to each other, we have to be okay sharing that power with each other. And apologizing is, and fucking up, as Sayu said, and being okay with that, but realizing that the only true way to apologize to each other is to mean it. People apologize all the time for these transgressions to each other, and they don't mean it. And that's why apologies feel so weak these days, right? But how do I truly say, like, my intention is to be here for you, is to be a supporter, is to be a co-conspirator with you, and to get this big piece of steak together, not to just sit here as a Black woman and keep everybody else out.
Jen, can I jump in on this again on this issue of power? Because also someone has a question for me about the question is about the scarcity mentality and how it relates to power. And again, in terms of learning, it's been, and I talked to my team about this because we've uncovered a lot of issues in our organization as they relate to white supremacy culture. And one of the things that has been pointed out to me is this issue of positional power, right? And it really took me a minute to kind of absorb that, because like this person, Maciel, asking this question talks about, how we've been historically been denied that power. And we've grown up as women fighting for power. So outside of my organization, I am fighting the man, if you will, the system, like working within capitalism to raise money for a system that is going to disrupt capitalism. All of that is happening outside. But then I come into my organization and I am the boss. And it makes perfect sense and it seems so obvious, but because it's not, what I said to my team the other day is like, look, on a day-to-day basis, I think of myself as a little immigrant girl from Belize. Like I look at myself in the mirror and I see, maybe this is just me not wanting to age, but it's really like I am a naturalized citizen of the United States. On literally every day, I wonder if I will be able to hold on to that citizenship. I wasn't able to vote in this country until after living here for 17 years. So how I see myself versus the positional power that I have in my organization and in other settings are really miles apart. But I have to be able to hold those multiple truths. That yes, indeed, outside of my organization, I have very limited power. I have a lot of voice. I don't necessarily have a lot of power in many situations. But in my organization, I also hold a lot of power. And now the phase of the work that we're engaged in is, what are these new models that are non-hierarchical, that involve shared leadership? We don't know as many of them. We know of them conceptually, we read about them. And so I think that we have to acknowledge that, but it's very hard. And I have a huge support network, or actually a small, tightly knit support network of other women of color leaders, because we need each other to be, to affirm and to exercise some of these tensions and questions that are harder to do within the organizational context. Because I have to accept that it is true that I am the boss and that I have positional power. And then if I want to change that, what is that going to look like? And also, how do we bring other people along who, sorry, this is a long answer, I'll just stop this. Like, other people, they may be asking for shared leadership, but are also have not had the inexperienced in exercising leadership. So they want it, right? But we don't know, just like we have been learning how to exercise our leadership and our power, people don't always know that. And so it's a lot of learning at the same time. And it's really, really messy. But we're super, as an organization and as a leader, I'm super committed to it. It's just going to take us a while to get there, to build a new model.
So the final topic, and I want to leave, because I think you just answered one question. We had one other question, but I want to get to this one because I think it's probably one of the most important things for allyship, is using the privilege that you have. Like, although we're all a part of a marginalized group, we're all women, and, you know, women of color, 3 of us are women of color, we still have a lot of privilege that we can use. So how do we do that? How do we do that to lift up people who are just a little bit lower on the hierarchy than we are? And I don't know, is it something you practice, or is it something, you know, you have to practice the intentionality of it? Anyone can answer that.
I'll just say for me, you know, another portion, I saw you share her age, I'm 38. And another way to be an ally is intergenerationally. So I'm a millennial, and what I do now is I mentor, and sometimes they mentor me, Gen Z activists and young folks who are trying, I hate that I say young folks, I sound so old right now, but you know, like, you know, younger people who are really doing the work that I believe in. Because when I started in organizing and activism, I was propelled by Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown's deaths, and I just hit the streets. You know, I didn't have a blueprint except for the books I read, you know, all my life. I just was like, oh, I'm gonna tweet this and see if people come, and next thing I knew, it was a whole change in my lifestyle. And, you know, older generations, boomers and Gen X only really came around once I really got some solid ground under my work. And that's a struggle. And so one thing that I've tried to do intentionally is a lot of, in my city and across the South, Gen Z organizers reach out to me, and I'm intentional about spending time with them, even if it's digitally, empowering them, sending them resources. With internships, I'm too old for internships, right? So I send them internships. I make recommendations. I have no problem. If Jen posted an internship tomorrow, I would send it to my list of, you know, Gen Z little sisters, and then call Jen, right? Using that power to say, like, hey, these are my mentees. Can you keep them on your list? Can you look out for their names? And trying to give them, one, making this critical change, whether you call yourself an organizer, whether you are a nonprofit employee, whatever, you know, it is. What I would say is that it's a hard road. It's a lifestyle change. It's risk and it's sacrifice, and it's worth it. But the worth it part takes a lot of support and a lot of people having your back, and helping you have as many wins as painful moments and losses. And so I think the best way to open doors and help other women of color, even if they're your age, is to, you know, use what power, because we are all privileged here. We have positions, you know, we have titles, we've got a little money, more money than the, you know, average woman of color. If we're making more than $40,000 a year, right? And so opening doors as much as possible. For every opportunity I get, I try to pass on the next one. And I've learned that from mentors as well. So if I were to get another panel today, who could speak on that instead of me?
You know, I think we have 5 minutes. I think we have time to answer this last question from Lisa. She says, I'm so glad you asked this question about, you know, being a woman of color. You know, how do we, and Lisa, you can reply in the chat or Q&A if I get this wrong, but how do we claim privilege that you have as a woman of color and have ownership of that in a positive way? How do you do that? Recognize and claim that privilege as a woman of color and in a positive way? Is that? Anyone want to answer that? Yeah, she says I got it.
I mean, this is sort of an answer to Lisa's, but also to the earlier question. I think that one of the things that I have found I can do is see or name in people some of the talents that they may not be yet ready to name or own. And I do that specifically, you know, in some of the examples that Tommy was saying, like, here's an opportunity, apply for it. Here's a job that I think you would be good for. The number of times I've done that and have people say, well, I can't apply for that job. I don't have the qualifications. And I'm like, well, I read the qualifications and I thought to call you. So obviously I think you have the qualifications, and just kind of really supporting that. I mean, also, I think like, this question sort of gets to my earlier point. It's like, I think we have to own that we have positional privilege, that people actually listen to us. And maybe this is all of circling right back to the very first point, is that we don't see ourselves as having the kind of power that we have. But when Trump is coming after Ilhan or Rashida, it's because he understands, or AOC, he understands how much power they have. And that's why he's coming after them. That's why he's not messing with other people, right? And so we have to, you know, be able to see in ourselves the same things that other people see in us, and then leverage that for our own growth and to support others.
That was an excellent way to end. You are absolutely right. He is afraid because he knows how much power they are, and we can help them. We can help boost their power by being consistent allies for them, right? We can make them stronger. And that was the whole point of this panel. So anything else before we close out? Any other questions? I think that's it, actually.
I think Sarah's been a perfect example of how white women can make space for women of color.
Yes, which is why I wanted her on this panel. That's exactly why I wanted her on this panel. It's a very strong ally. Yeah.
Well, thank you for saying that. But honestly, like, being here is an absolute fucking privilege for me to be able to be involved in this conversation and continue to help get my white women together, and for us to be able to reflect on that position, the positionality of power, you know, to do that work, as both Tammy and Sayu have been really clearly, you know, advocating for. So hopefully we will be able to, you know, continue to do that as we move forward. And thank you all, and thank you, Jen.
Thank you so much. We have 2 minutes to spare. I can't believe we got all that in. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.